All right, so these are the properties of parallelogram. So the definition of a parallelogram is that the opposite sides are parallel. But if we have a parallelogram, then we also know some special things about the opposite sides, which is that they're congruent. We know that the opposite angles are congruent, and then we know consecutive angles are supplementary, meaning that they add up to 180 degrees, okay? And again, none of these are parts of the definition. The definition is only that the opposite sides are parallel. And what happens is if we know the opposite sides are parallel, we can actually prove all of these things. When you start thinking about parallel lines and the fact that they kind of go off at the same angle, that leads us to some of these things about the opposite angles being congruent, about the consecutive angles being supplementary, all right? And then what also happens is if the opposite sides are parallel, it kind of locks us in at certain distances as we go off at the same angle, which is why the opposite sides are congruent, okay? So please understand the definition is that the opposite sides are parallel, but now we have all these special properties, and they are that opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary, okay? So if I look at this guy, says find the missing values. So let's start with talking about the sides. And we can talk about the sides and the angles kind of separately and individually here. But when I look at this thing, because the opposite sides are parallel, I know it's a parallelogram. And now special properties for parallelograms is the opposite sides are congruent, which means if side BC is 10 feet, the opposite side must also be 10 feet. Okay, so AD is 10 feet. If I look at side DC, DC is 4 feet, so the opposite side must also be 4 feet. So AB is 4 feet. So that kind of takes care of the sides. Let's start talking about the angles. The opposite angles are going to be congruent. So when I look at this thing, once again, angle D is 125 degrees. So the opposite angle must also be 125 degrees. And what's really nice about this is it kind of looks that way. It looks like D and B are the same. Well, that's because they are the same, okay? And so that's 125 degrees. So let's see, that was angle B. Let me label it over here, the measure of angle B. And now from here, this is the tricky one. This is the one that students tend to forget about. But the consecutive angles are supplementary. And so if I look at a pair of consecutive angles, so A and D would be consecutive angles, because as I draw this thing, those two would be connected, which means those two are supplementary, meaning they add up to 180 degrees. So to find that missing angle, I just do the 180 minus the 125. And so that's going to give me a 55 degrees right here. Okay, so that's the measure of angle A. And again, that comes from that supplementary thing. And again, that goes back to some of the properties we had when we looked at parallel lines being connected. We had a pair of angles that were supplementary in there. Okay, so that's 55 degrees. And now I can go back to the other property, which the opposite angles are congruent. And so when I look at this, opposite angles, A and C are opposite angles. So C is also 55 degrees. Okay, and you could use the opposite angles thing, which is the way I talked about it. See, those are opposite angles. Or you could look at consecutive angles again. You could say, hey, you know what? C and D are consecutive angles, so they have to add up to 180. So I've got the 125, and the other one also has to be at 55, okay? And so again, just using these different elements, these different properties to find some of these missing pieces. Look at the next one here, same kind of thing. So once again, I see opposite sides are parallel, so it's a parallelogram. In a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent, so this side is also 5 centimeters. Here, this side is also 12 centimeters. So again, the opposite sides are congruent. And again, I can label those off to the side here. I could say that, hey, CD is 5 centimeters. I could say that BC is 12 centimeters. And now I start talking about the angles. I say, hey, angle A and angle C are opposite angles. Opposite angles are congruent. So the measure of angle C has to also be 35 degrees. Okay, so opposite angles are congruent. And then once again, I'm back to the one that students tend to forget, and that's that consecutive angles are supplementary. So I identify a pair of consecutive angles. So here's A. The very next angle kind of working my way around is B. So those are consecutive angles. Consecutive angles are supplementary. So again, it's 180 minus the 35. That's going to give me a 145. And so that's the measure of angle B. And now from here, I could look at like A and D are supplementary because they're consecutive. Or I could say, hey, B and D are opposite angles. So D has to also be 145 degrees. Okay? So the definition for parallelograms, opposite sides are parallel, but the special properties, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary.